Okay. Okay. So we're trying to get tonight. We're in the process of trying to understand Rashi and Temurah, but I want to make explicit that we're doing the Rashi and Temurah as part of a methodological aim, which is to figure out whether Rashi actually, as stereotypically, interprets sugyot in isolation, or whether Rashi actually is engaged in the same process of integration as other Rishonim of putting all the sugyot together. Um, Maybe there are subtle differences, but fundamentally the project is the same. It's just he doesn't express it usually that way. That usually he presents the outcome for the sugya, but the outcome for the sugya is actually the result of the same kind of integration as what we would call tosfot. That's the broad question we're trying to discuss. For better or worse, the issue is that in Tamura we don't really understand what he's saying at all before we look at integration. So that's a plus or a minus, right? The plus is it gives us an excuse to say, well, we obviously have to look at what happens in other sugiyot in order to understand what's happening here. And the minus is Rashi shouldn't write in such a way that you can't understand him without looking at everything else, right? The goal of Rashi is certainly to try to perish on the local thing. So the really clever thing would be if Rashi ends up saying all sorts of things. You just don't, right? It's just that the endeavor that I'm trying to engage in, which is to figure out why he said those things, may not be understood unless you understand what's driving it from other sugiyot. Right? That would be the best case scenario. Then in the end, actually we understood everything Rashi said. It's just that we didn't understand why he said it. And now we understand why he said it because he's saying it in order to account for lots of things in other sugiyot. So what I want to do at the beginning is just set out all the elements that I think are useful in trying to construct what are the issues that Rashi has to integrate. So we're going to do that level one. We're going to do that by just going through the aspects of the Gemaras that Rashi has to integrate. We're going to notice part of that, the places where Rashi seems to say things that are not simply straightforward readings of those Gemaras. And that may get us a little bit somewhere. Right, then we're going to try doing something more radical at the beginning of this week, which is to look at what other Rishonim say about those same sugyot and see if we can figure out how understanding what drives those other Rishonim to in those sugyot may all of a sudden say, "Oh, hang on a sec. Rashi says this here. I didn't understand why Rashi was saying this, but now I understand that Rabbeinu Tam is saying a very similar thing in response to this. Most likely, Rashi is responding to the same kind of thing." Okay, and the overall project that I'm going to try and put together over the next 2 weeks, hopefully, although I keep on extending how many weeks this particular shiur. Right, the prep for this shiur is going to go. That's par for the course for me. Um, and I apologize for skipping last week, which I almost never do. Um, but I want to try and the perfect goal would be that we understand everything that Rashi said makes sense in context, but there are things we only understand why he says them because of external context, and that we can look at Rashi as responding to fundamentally the same things the other Rishonim are, and we use the other Rishonim to expose for us what the things are that Rashi was doing. Okay, that's the best case scenario. If I could do that, right, then I'm going to be in Olam Haba, but we'll try and get as close as we can to that. Okay, so let's say we start with our sugya in Tamura. Okay, in our sugya in Tamura, there are for Rashi at least three stages of understanding the Mishnah. And when I say the Mishnah, I mean the Mishnah as a whole. Right, the Mishnah as a whole says Akol Memirin, Lo Shadam Rashai Lahamir, right, Elashim Hamir Mumar V'Sofik et Arba'im. Right, so the three stages of our Gemara in Tamura. I'll put the Makard up so we can um try to let's do the chat first. Here. Okay, so here's now that in the chat there's a way you can get to the PDF of the Makurat, but I'm going to do them on the Word document. I think it's easier to see. Okay, so here we are, right? So the Mishnah says, right, we're only doing the black without the Rashi for now. Hakol memirim echad anashim ve'echad nashim lo shadam rashai lemir elashim hemir mumar v'sofeget arba'im. So first stage of understanding the Mishnah is the Mishnah before we get to the Gemara. Okay, we have three comments of Rashi there, which we didn't understand why he said any of them. But right, there is a way that Rashi understands the Mishnah before we get to the Gemara. I set it as a hypothesis that Rashi explains the Mishnah in such a way that you will understand the first stage of the Gemara properly, which gives you a bias towards saying that Rashi explains it according to the Havamina and not the maskana. Right, and that raised a certain amount of controversy, so we'll have to see if that holds up or not. But right, abstractly, the first stage of Rashi's understanding of the Gemara of the Mishnah is the Mishnah before we get to the Gemara. Okay, the second stage is now the Gemara asks a series of kushus on the Gemara, on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that there's an internal contradiction in the Mishnah, which is Hagufa Kasha V'Hadratani. Okay, so in order to generate that contradiction, you have to understand each line of the Mishnah, and you have to understand them in such a way that they contradict each other. Otherwise, you can't. Like the Gemara says there's a contradiction in the Mishnah. So, at this stage of the Gemara, you have to explain the Mishnah as in contradiction, and that would be challenging, right, for Rashi to present the Mishnah as in contradiction if he had done that in his explanation of the Mishnah per se. So usually Rashi has ways around that by saying the Gemara Mefarish and things like that. But there's a tension here because if the Gemara's opening is to claim that there's a contradiction in the Mishnah, so how would you explain the Mishnah in a way that makes sense in order to set up a contradiction? Okay, then there's this peculiar line in the Gemara where the Gemara attacks the contradiction. But it attacks one right. The contradiction is Hakol Memir Lechatchila, and and then something later is B'diavad. The Gemara says you couldn't have said that was Lechatchila, but you couldn't really have said it's B'diavad either because it's against the pasuk. The pasuk says it's usher, so we don't really know, right? So we could conceivably introduce another stage of understanding the Mishnah, which is how we understand the Mishnah after we attack the opening contradiction, but when we haven't yet made sense of the Mishnah. Like at this stage, the Gemara is still in contradiction. Okay, we don't know what Rashi is saying. Right, we don't know exactly what Rashi has in this line. Okay, then we have what is the teretz of the Gemara in Temurah, which we point out may or may not be in the name of the Amora. It may be Stam or it may be Amar Rav Yehuda. We have Amar Rav Yehuda, but not every text does. And that's a paraphrase of the Mishnah, which changes a kol mimirim to kol matfisin b'Temurah. That's one element of it. But we noted that Rashi also maintains the phrase echad anashim ve'echad nashim, and actually Rashi goes all the way through. Rashi quotes the Mishnah all the way through, and in the middle, he keeps on paraphrasing. Right, he paraphrases the paraphrase, and in the paraphrase of the paraphrase, he seems to emphasize this line echad anashim ve'echad nashim for reasons we don't understand. Okay, right. So what we have right now is where we have Rashi as he explains the Mishnah before the Gemara. Rashi as he explains the Mishnah at one or both stages of the right where the Gemara thinks still has not made sense of the Mishnah, and Rashi as he explains the Mishnah at the point where it makes sense on the basis of a paraphrase. Okay, so now we have to line up, right? The other sugya also have multiple understandings, so it's not you can't just say, oh, Rashi understands this sugya the same way he does there, because there isn't one understanding of the Gemara of the Mishnah here, and there isn't going to be one understanding of the Mishnah in other sugyot as well. Okay, I'm going to point out one further tension that has not that we have not raised so directly, since I just did this in the Rashi, I'll do that one more thing, which is that everyone understands that the word hakol is intended to right. Hakol asuyei mai is a standard move in the Gemara. It's the next move in our Gemara in Temurah. Hakol asuyei mai. So you have a tension when you say hakol x, both echad nashim ve'echad nashim. So is that right? So why do you have both of them? Does that mean hakol, meaning that hakol is intended to include echad nashim ve'echad nashim, or is hakol, or must hakol be intended to include something else? In which case, so what is echad nashim ve'echad nashim doing there? It's a really weird construction. Okay, and that construction, so far as I know, is unique. Right, to say hakol with two echads. So I want to put that in as one of the issues that has to be addressed. Right, obviously, the Gemara raises issues that have to be addressed, which is right. If hakol is chatchila, isn't there a tension? Either way, why is the Mishnah written in such an odd, long-winded way to tell you just one thing? Right, all the Mishnah tells you is that if you do Temurah, you get malchus. Right, why are we engaged in this? Right, in this right three sentence structure to say don't do it. If you do it, it works and you get malchus. Right. You could just say if you do it, it works and you get malchus. Right. One sentence. Right. So that's a right. So that's a tension, and then also the whole conversation takes place in the shadow of a pasuk, which says it's usher. So what are these havaminas in the Gemara? Okay, that was the Mishnah in Temurah. But I think it's going to turn out pretty clearly that home for everybody, including Rashi, is chulin. Right? That Torah is not really the place where they work their interpretations out. They work their interpretations out in the context of chulin, and then they apply them to Torah. Okay, saying that about Rashi is already a methodological. Right, it already makes that methodological leap. Okay, so let's take a look at how many different ways there are to understand the Mishnah in Tmura in the context of the sugya in Chulin. So
Rabbi Clapper,
yes,
I'm just as a matter of curiosity,
yes.
is that something that we see about Rashi elsewhere? Like, are there other instances where this is clear that Chulin is home base?
I don't know about that. My suspicion is that Tmura is not home base more than Chulin is home base. My suspicion is that
Sure, sure.
Tmura gives me the feeling that it's assembled for it. Tmura is an assembled Masechta out of lots of conversations that could have been elsewhere. Right? There's almost no home Tmura conversations. I don't right that's my guess. This is where again I'm always an imposter because everybody else does Daf Yomi except for me. So everybody else knows Shas, right, with Rashi, and I don't. I'm just building off little bits that I have learned over the years, and we'll see if it holds up. Right? I have a limited data set. We'll see if it holds up. That's my very, very speculative guess. In this case, I think there's a lot of evidence that Rashi is thinking through Chulin, as we'll see again as we'll go through. But is that going to apply in Daf Bet Bet? I couldn't tell you that. Okay, so in Chulin we have the following. So we start off with the basic structural thing in the Mishnah Chulin is that it has two phrases Hakol Shochetin. You have to explain both. In addition to that, in the first one it has a Kol Shochetin and Shchitas and Kshera, which is what our sugya in the beginning of Chulin, what the sugya in the beginning of Chulin builds off on. But I don't want you ever to forget that there are really two of them because that's what I believe the first time I taught this sugya. And so, for awareness in the background, on Ted Zion, the Gemara will finally get to the second. And what it does there, it says that we have two options. One is we can say that a kol shochatin in both places means everybody shechts. And in each case, it comes to include a different category of people who can shecht. That's one teretz. And the other teretz is that one of the hakol shochatins really means hakol nishchatin. Right? Even right that a kol shochatin, or we want to raise it doesn't mean everyone shechts, it means everything is shechted. We shecht everything. Okay, so if Rashi is reading the sugya in Temura with that in mind, he has to know that there's a possibility that hakol that we think that hakol memirin is the same thing as we are memir everything, and not that everyone is memir. Right, and that of course would easily account for the redundancy of echad nashim ve'echad nashim because it's on a totally different axis. We, both men and women, are memir everything. Right, that would resolve that. So we have to be the first thing that the Sugya in
In
Chulin gives
fact,
us. Yeah,
I haven't gone through the ones in Chulun, but is it possible that in Chulun you have also the way you possibly have here, that is there are two readings, that it's either the people who are doing the shechita or whether the shechita is kshera after the fact that they've done it. Those sort of questions come up in Chulun. I don't.
yeah, they come up, but in Chulin, sorry, we solve the apparent redundancy of the first Hakol Shochet and Shchitzas and Kshera by saying, there are cases that are lechatchila and cases that are b'diavad, and there's a case that even lechatchila that we wouldn't have expected, or there's a case that's kosher but only kosher b'diavad that's included by Hakol. Right, that's one. Right, that's certainly the solution in Perek Aleph. But for the second Hakol Shochtin, there are two solutions. One is to take the same solution and say, okay, we have to apply it twice. And the other is to say, no, the second Hakol Shochtin has nothing to do with who shechts, it has to do with what is shechted.
Uh,
Okay, right? That's a machloket on daf test, right? That's at the end of that sugya. But usually when you do the first sugya in Chul, they say, this is my error. right? You don't. You're right. You just do the first Mishnah, so you don't realize that there's a second one, and that you have to account for the second one also.
Um,
Okay. In addition to that, within the sugya in the very beginning of Chulin, there are There's one stage in which the Mishnah in Temurah is explicitly mentioned, and there's one stage in which the Mishnah in Temurah is not explicitly mentioned, but you could think, oh, well, I have to account for it now. So let's take a look at the sugya in Chulin again. Right. So the sugya in Chulin begins by posing what it sees as a stira, which is lichora, the same stira that begins the sugya in Temurah. Hakol shochati l'chatchila, u'shchitasen kshered diavad. Right, so we have a steer between two languages in the opening, two languages in the Mishnah. One implies l'chatchila, one implies b'diavad. But then we don't go off to the same places in Temurah, because in Temurah then we get to the saying, hang on a sec, how could it be either l'chatchila b'diavad? There's a pasuk. We don't get there. Instead, we challenge the premise of the stira in a different way. Okay, we challenge the premise of the stira by saying it's not true that the word hakol means lechatchila. It's not that it can't mean it lechatchila in Chulin, which was the challenge in Temurah. It's that the word hakol doesn't imply anything about lechatchila or this structure, hakol verb and hakol present tense, present tense third person verb doesn't imply lechatchila. Okay, so how do we know that it doesn't? So the first evidence we bring that hakol can't mean lechatchila is the Mishnah in Temurah. How do we know that the Mishnah in Temurah can't be l'chatchila? Not because of the internal contradiction, but because it's against the pasuk, right? So we skip to the second stage of the Gemara in Temurah. We say the Mishnah in Temurah can't mean l'chatchila because that would contradict the pasuk. Right? To which we respond, no, hasam k'katani tama. Right? The case in Temurah is different. Now there are at least two ways of understanding what the case in Temurah is different means. One is the case in Temurah is different because we know why it's not lechatchila there.
hmm.
It's an exception, and all other hakols do mean lechatchila. Right, and the other possibility is it means lechatchila, but not a lechatchila which is relevant. It's not a lechatchila, right? It's not a sorry, it means b'diavad, but not b'diavad which is relevant. Okay, so let's write. So the Gemara's havamina here is now, right? And so the Gemara has a kasha from Temurah, and it has a kasha on the claim that every hakol is lechatchila, meaning a kasha on the opening stira of the Gemara. Right? It supports Rav Acha Bred Rava and challenges Rav Ashi's opening stira, and then it says no, there was something you didn't understand about that Mishnah in Temurah. The thing you didn't understand about that Mishnah in Temurah allows me to put the contradiction back together again. So that's two stages at which we can understand the Mishnah in Temurah. And we have to figure out, okay, so only one of those can be the maskana of the sugya in Temurah. And it's either the makshe or the teretz of the Gemara. The makshe could be Rav Acha B'Rav Rashi, or it could be the Stam interjecting. Right, we don't know whether the question Rav Acha B'Rav Rashi just says really is every hakol lechatchila, or if he says how could every hakol lechatchila be this? But the answer hasam k'katani tama is definitely not Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi's answer shows up at the end of the sugya. So there are two stages. Right, the Gemara now has two stages of understanding the Mishnah in Temurah. Only one of them can be the maskana. The other one could be the havamina, but that's a little bit weird because the havamina in Temurah is that there is a contradiction. And here, the havamina is designed to reject the contradiction. So it doesn't seem as if we can line them up that way. Well, if we can't line the havamina up with the havamina, well, now we could reverse them if we wanted to, or we can try and develop a more complicated thing, and then we could remember that there are at least three stages in the Mishnah in Temurah. Okay, so we have to figure out how we're going to line these up. Now, in this case, we're taking a look at what Rashi does with this. So Rashi explains after Rashi is mefarish the seifa of the Mishnah. Right? Rashi says hasavik kantani tama means the rest of the Mishnah after the line of kol mimirin. So Rashi says what it does is the akar lahakol deresha the lo tema lechatchilahu. Okay, so Rashi says the maskana uproots the kol of the resha, so that you will no longer think that that hakol means the chatchila. And really, what the resha means, says Rashi, is hakol din tmura noheget bahem. Now that looks pretty clearly like what Rashi is saying is that the maskana here is that hakol is not lechatchila, it's b'diavad, because we reread the hakol to talk about the object as opposed to the subject. It's possible but difficult to say hakol din tmura noheges bahem means that din tmura is noheges by everybody who does tmura. That's a very difficult reading, right? It's much easier to say all animals have the din tmura noheges bahem, and so what Rashi is doing here is importing the answer on Daf Tet Zayin into here. And when Rashi says Hachik Amar, it's hard to believe that Rashi isn't actually quoting the sugya in Torah, which is Hachik Katani. So it could be that we are supposed to line up the maskanas, but we have to figure out how to line up the havaminas. Okay, then Rashi goes and throws in something entirely spontaneous. Rashi says, okay, now we've solved the problem, right? At this point, when we get to this line, Rashi has solved the sugya in Chulin. Right? Right? Why would I think every akol is the chatchila? When the Mishnah in Temurah says it isn't, the answer is the Mishnah in Temurah is different. Because the Mishnah in Temurah has a second half which tells you that hakol is not lechatchila, but every other hakol is lechatchila. Good. But then Rashi says, hang on a sec. That's not a really good explanation of Temurah. Because Temurah has all sorts of really long-winded verbiage. And I'm not really convinced by this, right? If really what it meant was hakol, right? Hakol as the object as opposed to hakol of the subject, why not just write it differently? Why don't we just say hakol shehemiru, which doesn't have the same structure and therefore wouldn't imply the chatchila? So Rashi tells you spontaneously, lashon tanaim huzeh, kemo hakol shochetin hakol samchin hakol chayavin. Hilchach hacha afagav tutzrach larich l'shina tanas lashono. So Rashi says none of this in Temurah. Right? Nothing in his explanation in Temurah tells you that, oh, by the way, in the end, the Mishnah is too long, but it shows this language just because it rhymes with the other Masechta. But in Chulin, Rashi goes out of his way to explain this to you. So that's a little bit odd. Right? That's my first strong suggestion that where Rashi works everything out is here in Chulin. Right? Because there's nothing in the Sugya in Chulin that compels Rashi to throw this line in. This whole section in. But it tells us, okay, now we know what drives Rashi. If Rashi is engaged in in putting everything together, then we can't ask the question in Temurah, hang on a sec, that doesn't make any sense. Why is the Mishnah so long-winded? That doesn't bother Rashi. Rashi takes it as a given that the Mishnah is going to begin Hakol Memirin because that's the language of the Mishnah. And then the only question is, given that you have to start the Mishnah Hakol Memirin, what does it mean? Right? Rashi is not interested in the question of efficiency. Okay, so that's where we are in the first stage of the sugya in Chulin, and now as far as we and Rashi are concerned, we understand what the Mishnah in Chulin says. The Mishnah in Chulin just says Hakol, really Hakol din Temurah noheges bahem, and it's really just b'diavad, whatever that means. Right? It's a language of b'diavad. It's not a language of the chatchila, and don't be bothered by the efficiency because that's just the language of the Gemara. So now the Gemara at the end of it says, yeah, you're right. Hakol doesn't mean lechatchila. Hakol doesn't mean b'diavad. And Rav Ashi explains, you had my kasha wrong. My kasha wasn't based on the premise that hakol means lechatchila. My kasha was based on the premise that the language of the Mishnah in Chulin is inefficient. It didn't have to say hakol shochatin shchitas shera. It could have said hakol sheshachatu shchitas shera, or hakol sheshachatu shera, or right, something like that. Okay, so Rashi goes out of his way to explain to you that there's no efficiency problem with the Mishnah in Temurah. After which Rashi says, yeah, but there's an efficiency problem. But my whole kasha was there's an efficiency problem with the Gemara and Chulin. Okay, so that's Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi explains what his kasha is, and Rashi explains what Rav Ashi's kasha is, which is right. And again, I have to remember that at this stage we're only in the kasha. Right at the end, right? Then this right. All we're trying to do is put the kasha together, and then the Gemara is going to give an answer that right that there are cases that are al and cases that are b'diavad, or right. That's the whole purpose of the rest of the sugi, which is not our issue at all. But Rashi spontaneously in his commentary of Ashi says, "Hang on a sec, v'i kasha b'tmur nami hatani hadar mefarish." Right? Hang on a sec. The way Rav Ashi just explained it, well, we should have the same problem in Tmura. Right? That's just Rashi again. You don't need that for the Gemara. Right? As far as the Gemara is concerned, we got rid of Tmura. Tmura doesn't prove anything. Now we're just trying to solve the problem in Chulin. And the way we solve the problem in Chulin is by saying it's generated internally. It's nothing to do with Hakol Bein L'Chadchila. But Rashi goes out of his way the first time to tell you that by Tmura there's a reason we're not efficient. And then, after Rav Ashi explains that by Chulin we do worry about efficiency, Rashi comes back and says, and by Tmura we're not, and he gives a different reason. Okay, Rashi says, the Ikasha, B'Tmura Nami Hatani Vada Mefarish, you're going to tell me, hang on a sec, right? If that's the case, then why isn't Tmura also an internal contradiction? Just like Rav Ashi is here. And yet, Rashi knows that nobody in Tmura asked that, right, ends up with the Gemara in Tmura just ends up saying there is no contradiction. Right? So Rashi peculiarly here says, how can Rav Ashi claim there's a stira in Tmura? Well, of course, it's the same as the opening line in Tmura. The answer is because Rav Ashi says, because Rashi knows that the Gemara in Chulin's answer is there are two different cases, and in Tmura we're never going to give that answer. So Rashi says there must be a different explanation for for not being worried by the language in Tmura. So he gives a first level answer, which is kind of cheap. He says, "Hasam lo katani ki agavna akol memir Tmura and Tmura bahadi hadadi." You know what? The redundancy is only caused by the juxtaposition. Tmura doesn't have a juxtaposition, right? It has a line in between lo shadam rashai lahamir. But then Rashi says, "Hang on a second, you're not going to buy that for a moment, because lo shadam rashai lahamir is every bit as good a language of the B'diavad as Ushkitas and Kshera. So you can't do it just by literary formulation. So therefore Rashi says, V'imishum lo shadam rashai. So if you're going to tell me, no, my answer doesn't work because you should still have the Rav Ashi's problem in Tmura, that there's an internal contradiction which should require a resolution of the two cases of the sort, which isn't resolved by reading the Hachi Kamar. Right, because Achi Kamar, I will tell you, right, it's only the teretz for the second Hakol Shochatin, not the first. Right, the second Hakol Shochatin doesn't have a B'diavad language following it. So if it's because of that, no. Mishum deboy leasuke v'sofe get to arba'im leashmeidan delokin alav she'ein bo maseh. Rashi says no. The reason that we threw in the line lo shadam rashai, that has nothing to do with B'diavad and lechatchila. That has to do with a special chiddush, right? Special chiddush, which is that you get malkos for Tmura, even though Tmura is a lav she'ein bo maseh. So that's a whole new radical thing, right? So now Rashi is saying, you know what? We had to say Hakol Memirin because that's the language, and then, right? And then don't tell me that there's an internal contradiction. It's B'diavad. We're going to reread it, and we're going to reread the first line, so it's also B'diavad. Don't tell me it's redundant, because the L'chatchila and the B'diavad aren't juxtaposed. And if you'll tell me, but it's still redundant, because there's another B'diavad juxtaposed. No, actually, the whole Seifa of the Mishnah in Tmura is there to tell me this Chiddush that you get Malkos for Lav She'ein Bo Maseh. I would have thought you don't get Malkos for Tmura, and you do. Okay, so that means that Rashi is introducing a whole new sugya. This is a sugya that we saw in Bava Metzia, but actually will show up later in our parak in Chulin, which debates whether our Mishnah actually supports the position that Lav She'ein Bo Maseh Lokin Alav, or whether Tmura is not actually Lav She'ein Bo Maseh. Tmura has a Maseh because it is done via speech. But so let's once again, Rashi in Chulin is introducing a sugya from Tmura with no motive in the sugya in Chulin. Right? He's playing. Right? he's doing integration. He's saying, okay, hang on a sec. Well, I solved the problem with Mishnah and Tamura up here, but that raises a problem back in Tamura. I'm going to solve that. I solved the problem here, but that seems to me to raise a problem back in Tamura. Okay, so that's in terms of the evidence that Rashi is assuming that Rashi in Tamura is going to in fact be consistent with what Rashi says in Chulin. I think there's a really good argument that Rashi is engaged in an integrative project because Rashi keeps on throwing problems from Tamura into the Sugya in Chulin. Secondly, we have two starting positions for what drives Rashi. Right, one is that Rashi's interpretation is not going to be bothered by the question, why didn't you write something other than a kol mirin? Because he thinks a kol mirin rhymes, and that's a powerful impulse for him. Whether he's right or not is not our issue, right? That he just says that, and I'm not bothered by any questions about why we write a kol mirin, even if we have to reinterpret and go to all sorts of twisty turnies. That doesn't matter to me because we like our Mishnahs to rhyme. And then secondly, Rashi says that the purpose of the b'diavad part of the Mishnah, the purpose of the Lo Shadam Rashai Hamir Ella, is to teach you about the Malkos. Um, okay, but in Chulin, Rashi says that it's to teach you about the Malkos that you get Malkos and Olav She'ein B'Masa, and that seems to commit him unnecessarily to one side of a machloket. Because the machlokas Amarayim, it's in Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, whether you get Malkos and Olav She'ein B'Masa. So how does the other side of that machlokas read the Mishnah? So it could be that Rashi is just engaged in shorthand. It's lashmin you get Malkos for Tmura, even though it's either a lav shein b'masa or it's right, or it's a chiddush that it is a lav sheish b'masa. Or it could be that Rashi is engaged in some much more complicated cheshbon that we have to figure out. Okay. Um. Okay. Then we have. Okay. Then we have one other. No, let's just go on then. Okay. So we have that as background. What we started to do last time, right? Right. So we did these sugyas in the middle, right? So the sugya about Metzias, where you get the machlokas Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish about whether Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish about whether kala is a masa, sorry, which then is reflected as a machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and some other unknown Tana about whether lav shein b'masa lokin olav. We also did the fascinating sugya in Menachos, which said that the only way to solve, which suggested, right, where one Amora, Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marsa, suggested that the only way to solve the problem of an animal which might be a Tmura which might be a Toda or might be a Todas Tmura is to make another Tmura. And right, and that's how you can solve the problem of the breads for the original. To which the Gemara responds, "Hang on a second, Arba'in bekisvei v'kasher? What are we doing? Telling you to get malchus." Okay, but that line Arba'in bekisvei v'kasher is going to matter to us in a matter. Also, we should also point out though that Rashi, in his comment on that line, right, it says Ad Amar Yafrish Lechatchil L'Shein Tmura Davar Shu Asur U'Mischayvim Malchus. So there, right, so that line, the Sovig Arbayim is in contrast to the Lechatchila there as well. That might or might not matter. Okay, where we got to last time was taking a look at this Tosfos. The Tosfos, this is Tosfos in Chulin, right? We'll get back to Tosfos in Tmura eventually, but Chulin is our home, and our project for the next 25 minutes, I guess, is just to see if we can understand the positions within the Tosfos, and most specifically the position of Rabbeinu Tam. We'll see that there are at least three witnesses to Rabbeinu Tam's position, and so I have to figure out if we think that the way to put Rabbeinu Tam together is put them all three together. Do we think they're saying something consistent, or do we think that things got confused along the way, which often happens with Rabbeinu Tam? Okay, so Tosfos Chulin begins as follows: the line Hasav Ketani Tama, which is where Rashi says that the Seifa of the Mishnah in Tmura is Oker, the Hakol, and rereads the Kol. So Perish HaKunshas Akar Le Hakol Deresha, the Lotem Lechatchilahu. So Tosfos comments, the Lashon Ketani Tama Lo Mashma Kefirusho. Okay, Tosfos, I don't think that Rashi's right, because that's not what the phrase Kedekatane Tama means. And I find out everywhere else in Shas that I can see Kedekatane Tama actually provides a rationale. But Rashi doesn't seem to be providing a rationale. He just seems to be saying it tells you to reread the Lechatchila as B'diavad. It tells you to reread the subject as an object. So Tosfos' question is well taken. But okay, but maybe Rashi just doesn't care. That's what Rashi thinks Hasav Ketani Tama means here. Fine. Umasha pirish name b'maskana gabi the di'evet tarti di'evet lamale. And Rashi's explanation of the second stage of the Gemara in Chulin, Rav Ashi's explanation of his question, and then he basically quotes Rashi. Ein nira, that says Tosfos, that's also wrong. Why? The mishum v'sofek et arba'im lechudei lahavle lemisnei tarti b'di'evet davi matzi lemisnei hakol memirim b'memir sofek et arba'im. So Tosfos says, I don't buy Rashi's explanation, and in particular, I don't buy the stuff that Rashi threw in to explain Tmura. And Rashi said that the explanation in the end is that you have to introduce Malkos. The Tosfos says, you know what, I can keep your first line, which is what you're so into, the rhyming line, Hakol Memirim, and I can still write the mission in a more efficient way. So Tosfos says, I don't buy your line that this has to be included to write for Malkos because there's a more efficient way of writing that, and that's, we have to figure out whether Rashi is willing to ignore that or not, or whether that means that Tosfos is missing something about Rashi. Okay, then Tosfos says, I have a third problem with Rashi's explanation. The Ode. The question? Okay, the Ode. The Bereish Tmura Parech, in the beginning of Tmura Tosfos says, right, it asks the question, and the Gemara answers there with Rabbi Yehuda's line, and that's where our judge dropped last week. What? That's not our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says Hakol matfisim b'tmura echad anashim ve'echad nashim. So where did echad shogeg ve'echad mezid come from? So one possibility is that Tosfot actually has a different text of the Mishnah, but that seems really unlikely because there's no record anywhere of any such text of the Mishnah. So it must be that he thinks this is what the Hakol Memirin, the rereading of the Hakol Memirin accomplishes. It rereads the Hakol Memirim to mean Echad Shogeg ve'Echad Mezid. Now that can't be a switch from subject to object. That's a totally different explanation. And we have to figure out, like, so what does that do with what? So why are we both have Shogeg and Mezid and women and men? Okay, so this isn't even Tosfos' point. Tosfos just says, hang on a sec. If Rashi were right, it should have just said, no big deal. Right? The second half of the Mishnah is just there, Mishum Sofek et Arba'im. The first half is just there because it rhymes. And that's all the Gemara should have said. So Tosfos says that the end of the Gemara in Tmura gives the wrong answer if Rashi is right here. But along the line, right, Tosfos reveals that he is reading this sugya totally differently than Rashi. Okay, so Rabbi Tam says, right, and so far as we know, right, we don't know that we're in Rabbi Tam. We're just dealing with Tosfos' questions. The new Rabbi Tam, the Shinuye dehacha havi kahei d'tmura. So Rabbi Tam says, you know what? We have to explain our answer here. What answer here? So I think that right. Will was right yesterday, right, that the answer here is the answer in the first part of the sugya. Hasim kikatani tama. So Rabbi Tam says, granting that I already know what the sugya in Tmura means. The sugya in Tmura means Hakol changes to Echad Shogeg Echad Mezid. I now have to change kikatani tama in the Gemara in Chulin to match that explanation. The Shenuye Dehacha Have Kahai Tmura. Vachi Kamar. So this is what the sugi in Chulin means when it's explaining why you can't use the Mishnah in Tmura to disprove the thesis that every ordinary Hakol means l'chatchila. Hazam k'lekatani tama. What does this mean? The lahachi tana kol mimirim the mashma l'chatchila. Right. This is why. Right. This is why the Mishnah begins at kol mimirim, which implies l'chatchila. L'ashma inan. The shafilu heimir b'mezid. Mumar. Okay, so Tosfos says that the reason it tells us this is to tell you that I might have thought that Tmura only works by accident. It doesn't work if you do it on purpose. Why? So Tosfos tells you. The lo tema arbaim v'kisve v'kasher kedamarim batoda. So Tosfos, right, Rabbeinu Tam integrates the sugi in menachos. He says, my hava amina, based on the sugi in menachos, is I would think that if you get malchus, there can't actually be tmura. That would be loco mishalim. Even though there's no one to be mishalim to. You're mishalim to God because you tried. Right? Very, very odd. Or just, it's, right, there's kimle bin rabbin, whatever reason you want, you can't get two punishments for the same thing. So if you treat the second animal becoming kadosh as a punishment, and that, of course, raises much deeper issues, right? Why does the second animal become kadosh? Is it a punishment or is it something else entirely? But if Rabbeinu Tam works apparently reasonably on the assumption that the second one is a punishment, at that point, maybe, right? And Rabbeinu Tam says, so the half of the Gemara is that if you get malchus, then you can't, right? If you get malchus, then you can't, then the Gemara can't be effective. So the Mishnah comes to tell me that you get malchus even in the case of doing it b'mezid. Right, so a kol comes to include mezidim, and then the second half of the line is there a taliyat malchus. Okay, so now I see that Rabbeinu Tam is reading the sugya very much like he's not his right. He understands the hakol differently than Rashi, but as Rashi says at the end, he thinks the losh adam rashai, that's about telling you something about malchus. And the way to understand the structure of the Mishnah in Temurah is that, right, that kol comes to include a case as having malchus that I would have thought didn't. Okay, the case for Rabbeinu Tam is the case of Mezid. Okay, at which point Tosfos says, hang on a sec, v'kasha l'perusho, I don't understand Rabbeinu Tam, because in a different sugya in Temurah, it seems to suggest that actually the chiddush is that Temurah works b'shogeg, not b'mezid, because it says Vayahu is Temurah so yeh kodesh. What does yeh come? The rabot shogeg k'mezid. So how can you tell me that the chiddush here is that the Mishnah includes mezid? Really, the chiddush should be that the Mishnah includes shogeg. But you can't tell me that the chiddush of the Mishnah is to include shogeg because the Mishnah includes the case of malchus. So, right, Tosfos answers, V'yesh lomar, v'le'inin behema should take share lemizbeach, pashut lan shogeg yoter b'mezid. So that's a little bit odd to figure out what that line means, right? So Tosfos seems to be distinguishing and saying there's one chiddush about whether the kedusha works, and one chiddush about whether you get the malchus. I can't get the language of Tosfos straight. He gives a second answer, which is maybe we're talking about a case where there's no hasra. So there's no hasra. There's definitely no malchus. So in that case, shogeg is more pasha than mezid. Really, there are three levels. There's mezid without malchus. That's obvious. There's shogeg. Well, that's a little bit less obvious. That requires a pasuk. And then there's mezid with malchus, which doesn't require a pasuk but does require a mishnah. Okay, that's a very elaborate way that Tosfos puts the whole sugya together. But it tells you, okay, so the obvious reason not to accept Rabbeinu Tam's parish is Rabbeinu Tam's parish assumes that mezid is a bigger chiddush than shogeg, and that's against the Gemara. So we'll know why Rashi isn't going to read it like Rabbeinu Tam. But at the same time, Rabbeinu Tam has the really good kasha Rashi has. Rabbeinu Tam has on Rashi is you haven't explained the whole elaboration of the Mishnah. You explained the first line, but you haven't explained the whole elaboration. I need an explanation. I need an elaboration of the whole thing, and that Rabbeinu Tam says relates to Malchus, and so does Rashi. But we don't know why Malchus is relevant according to Rashi, because what's the chiddush? Rabbeinu Tam has an explanation for why it's important to introduce Malchus because that's a chiddush in the case of mezid. So what we're looking for is a way to introduce some kind of chiddush about Malchus for Rashi. So that Rashi can be explaining that the word hakol comes to include something which then gets Malchus, which we wouldn't have thought it didn't. We don't know what that could be. Okay, let's see how much further we can get in making sure we understand Rabbeinu Tam. So in what is again, I take as face value in the Kodesh Shitas Kamei, it reports that this is a Gilyona Tosfos Rabbeinu Elazar Mituch. Right, so Rabbeinu Mituch is one of the families that edits, lots of the later Tosfot we have, but this apparently is a marginal note attributed to one of them that was on the outside of a Tosfos that looks just like ours on the daf. So it says V'nir Rabbeinu Tam the Shnui Dehachav K'Haydi Tmura, and there here he explains he could be explaining Rabbeinu Tam or he could be doing his own thing. He says the Hasim K'Amar She'ein Lasos Takana L'Chatchila L'Inyan Zeh She'akor Halav. So what does that mean? So the Shunuya here in Chulin is like that in Tmura, because in Tmura it says you should not make a takana l'chatchila that is oker the love. That's really weird. The only way I can make sense of it, which is not quite all the way, is to say, oh, he is incorporating the sugya in Menachos. And somehow he reads the sugya in Tmura as saying the same thing as sugya in Menachos, that the maskana in Menachos, or the last Amora in Menachos, or Nachman says in Menachos, you can't tell somebody to do something that actually violates the love. But how you could read that into the sugya in Tmura, that's a mystery to me. But I think that's the only way I can, if the words mean anything, linyan zeshi akor halav, takana lechatchila, I don't have any idea. This is the only takana I have mentioned. Okay, well, lefiha maskana, the Yisrach HaKol Di'eved, but according to the maskana of the sugya, at least in Chulin, maybe in Tmura also, that the word HaKol means Di'eved and not L'chatchila. Yisrach le'asuyeh de'asr l'hamir keperish Rabbeinu Tam, o mishum sovek et arbaim keperish l'kuntros. I don't know why you think Rabbeinu Tam thinks it's talking about le'asuyeh de'asr l'hamir. Like that's not right. That's Rabbeinu Tam Dafka talks about the Malkos. And what do you mean the Chiddush is that it's Asr L'Hamir? That's the Pasuk. So I don't know what that line in the Gilina is doing either. And then Rosh Shmuel Verdun, right? New Torah says Alav Lo Yamir Ein Loke Davi Lava Nitak L'Aseh. What? The Mishnah says V'Sovek Etarbayim. So how can somebody offer a parish on the Mishnah, which says so the explanation of the Mishnah is you don't get Malkos because Alav Nitak L'Aseh. What? So I don't know what Rosh Shmuel Verdun relates to Rebbe Tam. I don't know how it relates to Rashi. Just we should be aware there's a totally wacky Rishon out there. And I don't know that we understand Rebbe Tam. I'm focused on Rebbe Tam, but it would be great if somebody figures out what Rosh Shmuel Verdun is doing. Okay, but what we have to do now is we have to look at the Sefer HaYashar. So the temptation is to think the Sefer HaYashar, this is actually Rebbe Tam, so this is a controlling one. As best I can recall, my Kabbalah from Dr. Soloveitchik is no. The Sefer Yashar is just another reporter of Inu Tam. Don't be fooled. In general, Dr. Soloveitchik said, never be fooled by whether a manuscript is written in first person or third person as a commentary. It tells you nothing about how good the text is. Okay, that was one of his rules, right? That people often think, this must be more accurate. No, because it could be that this manuscript has gone through 16 copyings, and the first person one has gone through 16 copyings, right? Whatever. Okay, people rewrite them both ways. Here's what the Sefer Yashar B'nai Tam says. Hasna Ketani Tam Alosha Dam Rashai Lamir. Tekatani Akol Memirin, Mashma Lechatchila, Velo Ketani Akol Shemiru. Hasam, Tamakid Mefaresh Vazil Losha Dam Rashai Lamir, we know that. The Easter Chleli Frushi Afila Mezi Dami B'Tmura. Okay, that's consistent. B'nai Tam says that the reason for the Sefer of the Mishnah is to tell you that even Mezi gets Tmura. The Itana Shehemiru, because if I had said a Kol Shemiru as a Kol Simemiru, okay, so he's not, right, he doesn't agree with Rashi, he doesn't think it's because it rhymes. He thinks you have to begin saying Hakol Memirin as opposed to Kol Shemira, because then I would have said, Hava mina di eved matfis bitmura, mezid miskavin lav or lo yikadesh bitmura. If it just said Hakol Shemiru, I would think the word Hakol Shemiru excludes lichatchila, meaning doing it on purpose. Okay, so Rabbeinu Tam clarifies, this reading of Rabbeinu Tam clarifies that when we say Hakol Memirin Echad, right, that means Echad Mezid v'Echad Shogeg, not because of the, right, not because just of the Hakol, but because Hakol Memirin, meaning that it's all people who do it on purpose. It's not after the fact. It's people doing it consciously. So you can be convinced by that or not. But that's Rabbi Tam's reading of, right? The Mishnah says Hakol Memirin in order to teach you that we are applying both, right, both Lechatchila and Mezid, and then it has to tell you, and both of those cases get Malkos. Okay, right. So the Hachi Isrich Lemisli Lo Shadam Rashai, Di Efsher Lashano Delo Lo Shemirim Lo Lo Shanemiru. All right, why? Sorry. So Hachi Tana Kol Memirin Mashmafil Achila Namit Mosim Tura. Darban Bekisve Vikasher. So the point of the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Tam, is that the Mishnah knows that we'll be astonished because we know this, right? Because the sugya menachos is rational; it's not just another sugya. How could it be that you deliberately set out to make something do something illegal and it works, even though you get malchus? How can that be? So the Mishnah comes to tell me hakol memirin, and they get malchus. Right. So right. So in the end, Rabbi Tam says, so you can't prove anything. So what the Sugya in Chulin says is, you tell me every Hakol is L'chatchila, but Temurah can't be L'chatchila. Rabbi Tam's answer is yes, Temurah can be L'chatchila. Just L'chatchila means something else. L'chatchila means you did it on purpose. It doesn't mean you're allowed to do it. Okay, so we have two radically different readings of the whole way in which the Mishnah and Temurah is read. According to Rabbi Tam, the way the Sugya and Chulin goes is, hang on a sec, doesn't a kol really mean lechatchila? No, it doesn't really mean lechatchila. It means mezid. Okay, if it only means mezid, so then what do you need the whole rest of the Mishnah for? You need the whole rest of the Mishnah to teach you that a mezid gets malchus. That's Rabbi Tam's reading the whole sugya. But it makes many assumptions. It assumes that you already assume that you're bothered by the notion of Mezid both working and getting Malkos, but that could just be Pashup Pshat and Chumash. It assumes that that you think that a Kol Mirin is a choice because of substance and not because of rhyming. And then then it assumes that that's once it's a choice that allows you to say that that's the Chiddush of Malkos. What we get is that, hang on a sec, Rashi gives a different answer to the framing of a Kol Mirin. Rashi agrees that it's about Malkos, but can't say it's about these Malkos. Okay, and Rabbi Tam says, right, and if you take my pshat, then you don't have to come up with all of Rashi's weird explanations of the language of the Mishnah. Okay, good, that's true. But what did Rashi mean? So what else do we have about in Rashi? So we have another Tosfos. Tosfos introduces another new factor. Tosfos says, "V'hadahamar hacha the Tana kol memirin b'shim revusa demezid." That which Rabbi Tam said, that we say a kol memirin to teach you mezid. Hainu linin hakrava the avram lakamana tmura nami kreva. V'ashminin hacha the af b'mezid kreva the salgadatach arbaim b'kisei v'kasher. So all of a sudden, Tosfos says there's another axis we could think about. So far, we thought that there are two issues. One issue is, does the animal become a korban? And the other answer is, do you get malchus? The question is, do you get malchus? Tosfos says, no, there are three stages. There's, does the animal become kadosh? Does the animal become a korban? And do you get malchus? And maybe, pardon? Yes, Richard.
So maybe this is the labanitak assay. That is, the assay would be the hakrava.
Aha! So then, when do you get malchus in the Mishnah? Only if you don't bring it?
Well, that's why he says that you might have thought that since it's the labanitak assay, you don't get malchut, but you do. But you do.
But it doesn't say. But that's our shvul b'redum. He doesn't say you would have thought. He says you don't get malchus. But I agree with you, right? I don't know where shvul b'redum. I agree with you that what we're looking for are ways to say, I might have thought you don't get malchus, but you do.
Right. This is another way.
This is another way to do that. That's exactly right. This is another way to do it. Right. And right, but there's also introduces a whole other possibility, which is it tells me, right, that the chiddush of the second half of the Mishnah is that, right, if is v'imhemer mumar, meaning that you bring it as a sacrifice. right? Or it could be that if you get Malchus and you obviously don't bring it as a sacrifice, right? All sorts of new options are opened up by Tosfos saying that there are three stages and not just two. Okay, then we have a new character. The new character is the Re. The Chol Zeh Lo Nihir L'Ri, but none of this makes sense to the Re. Because the Re, right now we're in Temurah again, right? The Re says, since the answer in Temurah is Hakol Matfisim B'Temurah, Echad Anoshim V'Echad Nashim, Uma Lo Lahazkir, Echad Anoshim V'Echad Nashim. So the Re all of a sudden says, hang on a sec, nothing Rabbeinu Tam is saying makes sense to me, because I'm just not willing to believe that the word Hakol comes to include something other than Nashim, than a Nashim and Nashim, when that's the language of the Mishnah. You could read it, you could go backwards, and you could say, no, obviously it has to include something which is not Nashim and Nashim. But the Re says, no, it doesn't make any sense to me. It says Hakol Echad Nashim V'Echad Nashim. The whole point is both women and men. Now, why would I think women and men is a Chiddush? So the Re says, Detana Bakol Memirin Lishna Alima Mishum Nashim. It says Hakol Memirin, right? In Lechatchila language, Lishna Alima is Lechatchila language because of women. The Amr Lekaman, the Kol Ini Medaber Lashon Schar, Uchsiv Hamir Amir L'Rabi Anashim. Because we'll have this utterly weird breita later on, which says that shockingly, when it comes to halachas of Temurah, everything is in masculine, as opposed to the rest of Torah, right, where we have feminine stuff about left and right, all the rest of Karbanos, right? Right. Sometimes we say Isha Isha, okay, but for some reason we decided to pick Temurah as the big thing. Right? Temurah is the big thing where we say everything is in Lashon Zachar, and we need a word to the Rabbi Nashim. So what would I have thought? The Salkatat Ahani Miyuta Vahani Ribuya. I would have thought that that both the riboy and the miyut are included, right? The riboy meaning the repetition of Hamir Yamir, and the miyut meaning that the whole parsha is written Lashon Zachar. What would I have thought? Ahani ribuya lashmina de tmuras nashim kadshi, vehani miyuta de lo mekarvan. Okay, so Tosfos says the havamina is that women's tmuros become kadosh, but don't get sacrificed. And the Mishnah comes to teach me that women's tmuros get sacrificed in addition to becoming kaddish. Now, do women get whipped? Interesting question. Right. According to this, presumably yes, because the hakol means that women are included in everything in the Mishnah. Okay, so now we have a Rishon who makes something significant out of the distinction between echad nashim ve'echad nashim. It's hard to read that into Rashi, though, right? That's not right, because what Rashi, we can try though, right? What Rashi says back in Temurah on the last line is. Sorry, I wish I had a faster way to do it. Yeah. Akol mitzris mitzmur echad nashim nashim kilomar shetofeses kedusha Temurah v'hema bein alpi nashim bein alpi nashim. So that's a little hard to read into Tosfos saying that if we're trying to make a distinction between just becoming kadosh and being a korban, this is not good language to do that in. Right? Tosfos seems to be emphasizing the kedusha as opposed to the hakrava. So I think it's very, very hard to read the Re back into Rashi. But let's see where we are in terms of Rashi.
You can just read the part about becoming kadosh. You could argue that the Temurah is a chidush, and you would be necessarily read it restrictively, applying only to men.
So what we're looking for, right? What we're looking for is to find a way, right? So now we have tools, right? We know that you can read the second half of the Mishnah as a chiddush about makos. We know that you can read the Hakol as being a chiddush about echad nashim ve'echad nashim. Okay, now what you're looking at is like, I think I didn't start this right. My son Yehuda had me read a book called Second Creation last week, which is about the development of unified theory in physics, and as long as you don't actually do the equations, it's really just cheshbon. Right? They have all these different things they're trying to reconcile. And that some of these things you have to reconcile the infinities, but really you take a tool from here, you put it there, and I felt very much at home If once I just abstracted out all the math and physics and put in Lumdish, right? Put in Lumdish ideas. It's like, well, this is exactly what I'm doing, right? So we know like there's a tool there, right? There's a step missing in the equation here, right? The sign doesn't add up, right? We're going to find a way to plug them all together, and then the question is that really the way you're supposed to read Rashi, right? So, right, Richard, you're right there, right? Because right, what I'm looking for now is a way to read the Rashi so that it is a chiddush about women, but it's a chiddush about kedusha and not a chiddush about right, and not a chiddush about hakrava. Now we'll remember that what drove
That
Tos,
that's what yeah.
yeah. So what drove Rabbi Tam's reading was Rabbi Tam thinks that everything is simulated by Arban Bekisv Bekasher. So just to be aware that Rashi has a good reason for rejecting that. So in the Shita B'Kabetz, he says, Mikol makom mihu kol osen raya de'asina mi perakatoda, that's menachos shuva genuvahi. You shouldn't be bothered by that problem. Dachi pirush Rabban Bekisv Bekasher davar lasos kain. What Rabban Bekisv Bekasher doesn't mean that we're bothered by getting malchus and the animal being kosher. That never bothered us. What bothered us was the notion that we were telling you to do something you get malchus for. So the Shita Gesed says if you read the right, if you read right, if you read the Mishnah in Menachos Rabbi Tam did, where the question is, hang on a sec, how could it be a kosher korban if you get malchus for making it? So then you get driven by all this stuff about Mazid and Shogeg. But if, says Shita Gesed, you read the Gemara in Menachos, which he thinks is Kipshuto, it's not asking that question at all. The question is asking is, how can we tell you to do something you get malchus for? So then the whole Mazid Shogeg thing doesn't get started. Okay, so now if we're putting together, how did Rashi read? How did Rashi read the sugya in Temurah? Well, Rashi is not bothered by the problem of Malchus and Korban. That never bothered him at all. Rashi is not bothered by the language of why does it say Akol Memirin? That doesn't bother him at all. Rashi does think that after you say Akol Memirin, the second half of the mission is designed to teach me that a case gets Malchus. What case is that? That case is women. We're almost there. Okay, right. That's where right. That's where we are now, and we'll see if we can find the right if we can find the missing piece. So next week we're going to try and understand how the Beit Midrash shall Ramban read this sugya, and maybe that'll give us the final piece or not. And then we'll look at the Achronim. If we get through the Beit Midrash shall Ramban, we'll get to the Achronim, and I keep on being, I guess, mostly pleasantly surprised that 1 week's preparation has lasted a lot longer. Than one shiur, which is good because maybe I will actually finish the book, uh, which is the project. All right, thank you for coming.
Thank
We'll
you
see
so
you
much.
again next week, and if you prepare, so the thing to prepare next week is all the Beit Midrash Shel Ramban.
Thank you.
Thank you, Latev. Okay, thank you for
And
coming.
does it matter which time I come?